Well, as we've been talking about exam preparation, and obviously this is the main subject, what's on everybody's mind at the moment, Kit, of course, and probably no one's more than yours, is the mock exams coming up. I know they're very important for teachers. In the last couple of years, we've not had those sort of reference points. You had to do your teacher assessed grades and so on. Mocks are coming. There's a range of attitudes towards them, especially among students, and I'm sure lots of parents listening at the moment will have children saying, they don't matter that much, it's only the mocks. Is there room for that view? What's your view on whether mocks matter, Kit?
Well, I've heard every excuse in the book that kids can give to not revise. And I've seen students being really very, very anxious about the mocks and overdoing it really, and spending too much time revising. And one of the things I'll talk about later will be, how they can make sure that time is used really effectively for revision, because especially in GCSE, kids are dealing with 11 subjects and it's very easy to get overwhelmed. So I think there's this kind of spectrum between, kids who are thinking, does this really matter? They're not the real thing. And the kids who are almost treating them like the real thing. And you need to find a balance. There's a balance to be struck. And as I said, in the GCSE survival guide, it's really, really clear. That comes through very, very clear that your job as a supportive parent is to make that balance between high support and high expectations of a young person, and it's also your expectations of yourself, because you're also working and doing all your own other things, dealing with looking after other children. That you have to strike a balance for yourself, and I think this is where mock exams come in. It's the opportunity to try out revision techniques, and so that they're expert revisers by the time that they actually get to the real one. It's the time to find out the areas to develop. I noticed already there were some questions in the chat about, well, okay, there's so much content in science, for example. How do we know where to revise? And we're going to talk a lot about that today as well. There's the one excuse that I think I'd like to reference here is the young person that says, I thought I would see how I do without revising. Now, let me know in the chat if you've heard your young person say that, because it's one that I know that young people sort of legitimize it. They find this excuse and they say, well, and then I'll know how much to revise for the real thing. And that kind of tallies with some kind of logic in their heads, and I've kind of I've said this to a class, as I know some of you will have said this, and I've looked across the room and some of them are like, oh yeah, I just said that on my way into the class, and they're all looking at each other like, you said that earlier on, didn't you? And it's quite funny. And of course the best thing to do is to try out how well you do by revising, and learn the techniques to revise, and learn what works and what doesn't work, and then have a really good bit of feedback from your school, because your school is looking to give a lot of good quality feedback about these mock exams to help the students target those things and find out their areas for development. Well, and then, when they go through these mock exams, by the time they come to the real thing, they just feel like another set of exams. And students often say that. They say, well, we did 2 sets of mock exams and the real thing was just like going through the motions, really. We knew what we were doing.
Yeah, it's so important, I think, when terminal exams can feel so high pressure, to find that comfort zone, and no better way to do that to make it slightly business as usual. Yeah. It's not going to be business as usual unless you've done that and rehearsed that in the past. I run the risk of boring everyone by always making a kind of analogy between education and sport, but anyone who's done any kind of sporting competition knows you don't go into it cold. You course, you train and you prepare, and you replicate as much as possible those match conditions in your training, so that when the match comes, pressure isn't an extra factor added on, or at least it's only that little bit extra that makes it a bit exciting, makes you get on your game. It's about finding that zone. There was a question, by the way, from somebody I just saw pop up in the chat asking, what is a mock exam and when are they? And that's bad sort of presenting on my part. I should have established that early on for those of you who are not familiar. They're practice exams that are staged in schools generally in sort of November, December time. Some do them in January, but they're rehearsal exams, and they can as well be really important if for some reason you're not able to sit the terminal exam. Isn't that right, Kit?
That is right, yeah. And that's something we've always talked about, and they've never been more important for the last 2 years, clearly. But we're hoping they're going to be real ones. Normally there are 2 sets, one around now, sort of mid-November, and one January, February, March. Some schools will do one set and that will just be in January. And they are intended to give the same experience. So students are just well prepared and they know what's expected of them in the real times. And they really work. We find them really very useful.
Absolutely. Well, should we move on to, well, you're well ahead of me. When we come to revising, I remember when I came to it, well, I didn't do much revising, to be honest, but I was sent to my room and had the door shut and maybe given a mug of tea and told to revise for 6 weeks. And that was about it. There are good ways to revise. There are bad ways to revise. Time is precious. And thinking back to that meerkat as well, you don't want to be revising for 8 hours a day without a break and not be able to balance it. So making the most of the time when you are in session is really key. So Kit, what do you find are the best ways to revise? What are the techniques that young people should be focusing on?
Yeah, absolutely. These aren't just plucked out of thin air. These are based off a really important study that lots of schools reference, a meta study which Dunlosky and his team studied 700 other studies. And these are the top 5, and I'm going to go through the top 5 and then the bottom 5 and tell you, you'll perhaps see your young people doing the bottom 5, and you should try and steer them gently, probably onto the top 5. The first group of 3 that I'm going to talk about is I'm going to call the self-quizzing group, and these are essential. Students must be doing these, and schools will be encouraging them to do these things. This is something that all students should be doing in their own time. It builds memory, importantly, the self-quizzing group. That's great for building memory. And it's essentially comes down to spaced, interleaved retrieval practice. And I'm going to go through those 3 things really quickly. So spaced just means you study a topic and then you leave that topic for a while and then you come back to that topic. So you space it out. You don't just do all of one topic and presume that's that learned forever and then never come back to it. You put little gaps in, essentially. So that's spaced. Interleaved means that you don't just do one topic at a time and finish that topic and then move on to the next one, but it's actually you bounce between different topics. And then retrieval practice just means self-quizzing, essentially. It just means asking yourself to try and recall some knowledge. And that's what I mean. It builds memory, because it should be just factual recall. It should be just, do you know this fact or do you not? And by asking yourself that, when you find the answer out, it helps you code that information deeper into your long-term memory. And we think long-term memory is infinite, but we know that short-term memory is definitely not. And so it's all about getting that information into your deeper kind of long-term memory, and importantly, so that it can come back to you very, very quickly. And that's what needs to happen in an exam when the students are trying to solve problems in the exam situation. So that's the self-quizzing group. Essential, students must be doing that. The higher order group I'm going to go on to in just a moment is really the stuff that puts the problem solving on top. It really is the students who are really aiming to get the very highest grades. And self-quizzing, that's absolutely essential. And students that are looking for good passes, that type of grade, 4s and 5s in new money, which is old money Cs, then you're really looking to put on the higher order thinking skills, and you need to do some of these 2 things from the higher order group, and they are elaborative interrogation and self-explanation, and I'll take you through what these things are as well. Now, I will say that schools will do a lot of this in lessons because they are harder to structure. It's okay, it's quite easy to find some quizzes and do them, but it's harder to do these higher order thinking things. So don't be discouraged if you find this harder at first. So firstly, elaborative interrogation is trying to explain how we know something is the case, or trying to explain how we know something isn't the case. And of course, by trying to explain how we know something is the case, then how we know a fact is a fact, then we understand it a bit deeper. And trying to kind of explain that, go through that process, is a very deeper, meaningful way of learning. So I'm going to give an example from physics, if that's all right. And I'm sure you all remember your physics really well. So here we go.
The only science
second law. And it's force is proportional to acceleration. So now, okay, I can say that till I'm blue in the face in my classroom. But really, when I say, well, on your bike, if you push twice as hard, you'll accelerate twice as fast, right? You'll gain speed at a higher rate. Oh, yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? By doing that, by the students actually putting themselves in that situation and trying to explain the thing, then they're going to have a better understanding of that law of physics. You can go further with that same idea, because a heavier bike, you will have to have more force for the same acceleration, or heavier bike, more mass, in other words, then less acceleration for the same force. In fact, double the mass, half the acceleration. And those types of things will allow them to sort of understand the topic deeper. And I think that's something that students get anxiety from, is not understanding. So I think that's a really useful thing to do. And also these mock exams are very useful for helping them identify the things that they didn't understand so well. And once they start to kind of explain their way through those things they didn't understand so well, then that's useful. That's useful to allow them to do this elaborative interrogation. So that's that one. And self-explanation, it sounds tricky, but actually it's not. It's explaining a method of working through a problem and explaining that to themselves. It builds problem solving skills, this one. And it's really useful if students can do this out loud. So if they can like explain to you maybe, or explain to their wall or to their cat or something, how you've actually worked through a problem. And I would suggest maybe, you know, if I'm thinking in physics as well, in a calculation potentially, you know, explaining how they've solved that problem. So looking back at their own book, how did I get to that answer, and explaining that in that step-by-step method. That is a really useful way to never forget how to solve that type of problem, and then be able to do that under pressure in the exam situation, which is the aim. So those are the top 5. Must be doing the self-quizzing, because you must be building your memory for modern GCSEs. It's really crucial. But then the actual higher order skills, the elaborative interrogation, self-explanation, are great for helping them to build the problem solving skills to tackle exam questions.
Yeah, can I come briefly on that, on those top 5? It's just to say, from my experience of working with students and their revision, those self-quizzing bits, of course, are great. I always think of that as like the equivalent of practicing your scales and patterns as a musician, so that you can do the more kind of creative stuff, which we're talking about in the higher order group. But as parents, so often there's a feeling like, oh, I can't help my child revise because I don't know science, or I don't know maths, or whatever. But actually, you can prompt that elaborative interrogation and self-explanation, even if you're totally ignorant of the subject yourself. You can read on the list, they have to be able to explain Newton's second law. You can ask them, what does that mean? Can you give me an example? And just to prompt that thinking and drive a conversation can be really helpful. And as for self-explanation, I used to always try and work with my students in, for example, in the maths context, rather than say, solve this problem, I would say, right, here's this problem, tell me what steps you're going to take to do it, and then follow those steps. So we could see the shape of it before we did the problem. And that same thing, you'll know it, of course, from humanities, like essay planning. You have your kind of essay planning structure, and then you write the essay. Well, the same can be true in all subjects. So I just wanted to kind of come in on that with some things that as parents, I think you can do it even if you're not.
You can be their best study buddy, you know, the one that doesn't get distracted and start talking and making jokes and being silly, you know, the one that can really work with them, and that's really important. That's really important that they have something like that. The bottom 5 then, and some of these are kind of, you know, the ones that don't do it unless, but all of them are ones that are often recommended, funnily enough, and feel a bit comfortable for students, but actually the evidence shows they're not as effective as the top 5. And there is one of them that's actually, the evidence shows that it has a negative effect, and I'll warn you of that one. So the first group is the don't do unless. Summarizing firstly, like making notes. Now, kids love to make notes, okay? But the problem with making notes, it takes up masses of time. So what you might find is your young person might try making notes for the first mock, and then they'll feel very disheartened when they realize how much they've got to do. And actually don't be afraid to convince them to actually just give up the idea of having these lovely, neat, extensive notes. The thing about making notes is it only really works, the evidence shows, if they have a set structure. So for example, if they were to structure their notes, question and then answer, that might be more useful than just writing out key information that they're expecting to memorize because they've written it out. So making flashcards with a question and answer is a great idea. And then they can use those to be self-quizzing themselves. That's really, really powerful. The other structure is a Cornell method, which is a kind of structured set where you can actually break down information into kind of key points. So some kind of structure. If they're going to do note taking, make sure it isn't just A4 sheets that they're just writing from top to bottom. Better, I think, to use notes that exist already. So use revision guides, things like that, to actually answer questions. I think that's a very useful thing. You know, bite-sized packs that the school might give the students, use those notes that exist. It's less comfortable, but it's far more efficient and effective use of the student's time. And I think that's the important thing to be doing. Students could get overwhelmed by the sheer time that revision will seem to take. But it comes down to the decisions and expectations students have of what revision looks like. And it often revolves around, I've got to have these notes, got to have perfect notes. And that's not the case at all. Best to let them tackle some questions, because remember, the knowledge needs to be really neatly organized in their heads, not on paper, because they can't carry that paper into the exams. So anything that can help it stick in their heads. The next one, I think this one surprises most people, and this is the one I get argued with the most when I do these things, is mnemonics, because we're all taught to use mnemonics, and we all remember certain mnemonics that do actually help us. But the problem with making up your own ones is you're actually trying to learn two things then, and there's kind of not a lot of point in doing that. I think if there's a tried and true one, if there's a tried and true mnemonic, like Richard of York gave battle in vain, will let you reel off the colors of the rainbow. That's a tried and true one. Everyone uses that. Stick with it. But I think it's, again, too time consuming. It doesn't necessarily not work, but it takes a lot of time to work. And the next one is imagery for text. And, this is making up stories or drawing pictures to help us remember a piece of text or a fact. Again, what you're having to do then is memorize two things. So I wouldn't recommend this one. And certainly the studies don't recommend it either. I don't want you to confuse that with something called dual coding, which is something that schools do in lessons, and there is evidence to say that that's good. But those are the kind of don't do unless you appreciate that it's a long-winded way of revising, or you use a structure. Now, the bottom two, the ones that don't do these, basically don't bother. They're more of a comfort blanket, unfortunately, is the way to think about them. And if that's what your young person needs, that's maybe okay, but help them and guide them towards the top five, essentially. Highlighting text, and there's a lot of thoughts about this, and students really love to use highlighters. And I think that a lot of students would be quite affronted if you said, give me a highlighter, you're not using them for revision. But they at least don't do any damage, I would say. But working through pages of text and highlighting them is shown to have no effect, essentially, in memory and study. And then lastly, rereading. Again, this is the one that is actually shown to more often take kids backwards. And I think the reason for that is by rereading something that they already have learned, they can bring up new misunderstandings, and they can actually take themselves backwards slightly. So I'm not saying reading is, of course, an excellent way to learn. It's one of the only ways to learn, but it's best for new knowledge. It's not best for revision. It's by rereading, you can get lost in it and you can confuse yourself, and that's a dangerous thing to do. Of course, using the text to solve problems isn't just rereading it for no reason. If you have some questions that are about the text that you're reading, then you're reading for a targeted reason, and that's very, very powerful, because you're reading with purpose, you're looking for information, and that is very, very effective. So there you are. Those are the top five and the bottom five. And
can I ask a quick question?
I'm not saying don't let them do that, but I am saying the mock exams is the time to try these things out. And now I hope that you parents are equipped with that bit of knowledge that we know that self-quizzing is the way to do it. We know that's good practice. So I can now guide my student, my young person, to not spend all that time getting quite worried about they've got to have these super neat notes, and steer them onto the things that we know are effective.
We had a question in there from Claire, who asked about revision clocks and wheels. I'm not actually familiar with revision
I'm not.
wheels, but it makes me think of sort of mind maps as being another sort of thing. A version is it another version of making notes? Are they useful.
Yeah, so again, that sounds like a structure then, doesn't it? Because if that revision clock or wheel is a structured way to make notes that then they can then use for self-quizzing, then that might be very, very good. What it makes me think of a revision clock or wheel is a set of questions with answers around the side, and you can sort of work through them in that way. Is that I don't know if that the questioner would like to clarify that. But that if it's got a structure, then making notes can be effective. And that essentially is, making a set of flashcards. I mean, flashcards can be really great because what you can do is you can work through them as a question, and you can say, right, I know that one now, I keep getting that right, and I'll put it in the I know it pile, and I'll put this one that I keep getting wrong in the I don't know it pile. And you just work through this deck of cards, and essentially one pile gets bigger and another pile gets smaller, and that's the aim really, as more gets remembered.
Well, and that method, as you will know, of course, is called the Leitner method, of that way of sorting cards to prioritize and whittle down to those areas you don't like, which is something I believe in very strongly. As far as mind maps and similar go for me as well, I do think there's a lot to be said for systems that allow you to see the schema within the knowledge. Like, obviously, there's a huge amount of knowledge to learn, but if you can start to see the structure within, to see how things interrelate, that's enormously helpful to start to get. If you think of all this knowledge as being like a mountain to climb, where you've got some handholds and you know these bits and you know these other bits connect to that, that starts to come, it makes the whole challenge a lot more digestible. So I do think anything like that sort of schematic is helpful. One other point from me is on the sort of note-taking point of view. My father told me, I don't know why, he was a bit of a taskmaster when I was very little. He taught me how to make notes according to his method. And he said simply, when you're making notes, only make notes on the things you didn't already know, so that your notes become extremely condensed. And if you go back again over something, again, you're condensing it down. So the danger in all this sort of note-taking for the sake of it and copying out stuff is that you're spending time, as you said, Kit, on doing stuff you already knew, not making time to focus on the gaps. But that sort of self-examination thing, I think, is very helpful. And that's really where we come into what we were talking about before about retrieval practice, self-explanation, and so on.
I just want to tackle this question about additional needs. I think it's really, really crucial, actually, and a good question. Thank you for that one. I think it's not so much about the technique for many kids. It's about knowing the thing the format that works best, right? So there's many ways to do self-quizzing. We know we have a lot of evidence that for across the whole spectrum of young people, anyone trying to learn anything ever, actually, that quizzing and self-testing is the most effective every single time. But there's more than one way to do that, and it's about having perhaps the additional need is maybe a sensory one, so looking at a computer screen for a long time isn't the right thing for them, or perhaps it's about it's about reading. So there's different ways to do self-quizzing that maybe aren't so that are maybe audible or more visual than having to read lots of words. And I think that's it. Understanding the individual learner with additional needs is the crucial thing. So finding out I think revision does need to be comfortable in terms of the kind of format and the kind of whole experience of revising, and it needs to be right for that young person. But don't lose sight of the fact that we have strong evidence for this self-quizzing, and that's the best way to do it. I hope that answers that question. Something learners with additional needs is obviously central to our planning in schools, and we do an awful lot of work on it. It could be as simple as the background on the computer screen, making it dimmer and allowing them to still access those electronic quizzes. It might be very powerful. I'll if there's more questions about that, then do feel free and we'll tackle them towards the end.
Absolutely.